All right, this is a video from Andrea. As you can see, I have moved away from my office and into my house. So behind me you can see my piano, I think you can see it, and some decorations and some DVDs. So Father Wickert, during this time that we cannot be together, gave me permission to send you some videos to Disciples Club and to Faith Formation or Sacramental Preparation about Bible stories. So I'm going to start with the story of Samuel. Now I'm going to time this for only 15 minutes so that way you will not lose your attention span. I've heard that the attention span for most people is about 20 minutes. Although I've seen kids that can pay attention for a really long time. So we're going to set a timer for 15 minutes. Here you are going through my house setting this timer. Now, instead of starting at the very beginning with the creation story, we're going to start sort of in the middle of the Old Testament with Samuel. Samuel was a little boy who came to give his whole life to God, and it wasn't his first choice because he didn't have any choice in the matter. God calls us, and we respond to what God calls. Now, Samuel's mother was a very sad, sad lady, but she became happy because of what God did for her. She was one of two wives. Now, in our culture, men don't have two wives, especially not living in the same house at the same time. However, in Samuel's time, his mother was the second wife, and her husband loved her very much, but she was sad because she didn't have any children. So one day, Samuel's mother, whose name was Hannah is like our name Anna or Anna or Anne or Hannah. Hannah went to the temple at Shiloh to pray. And she was praying and praying so earnestly and so sorrowfully and with so many tears that the high priest, Eli, came up to her and accused her. "Young woman, why are you doing this? You seem to be drunk." And she said, "No, my Lord, I am not drunk, but I am only in sorrow because I do not have a child." And Eli said, "Your faith is so strong. When you come back in a year, you will be bringing a child with you." She was so happy, and that's exactly what happened. She had a little boy. She named him Samuel. And Samuel, she decided to dedicate to the Lord. His whole life would be dedicated to the Lord. And we ask parents to do this. When you are baptized, we ask them to dedicate your lives to the Lord so that you can serve him all of your days. That's exactly what Hannah did. So as soon as the child was able to walk and talk and eat by himself, she brought him to the temple and she said, "See, this is the child that I prayed for." And every year she would come and see him, and she would bring him a little coat, and she would bring some offerings for the priest. Now Samuel had a lot of different things that he could do in the temple. He could polish the lamps. He could make sure that the lamps had oil. That was the only kind of light they had. He could make sure that everything was nice and clean in the worship place. It wasn't a temple like the grand temple that Solomon built, but it was big enough that people came there to sacrifice, and they came there to pray. Let's talk a little bit about sacrifice. Now, when you go to the store and you buy, let's say, a big chicken, then what you do is you take it home and you cook it. You might cook the whole thing, or you might divide it into parts and cook it. If you're a meat eater, if you're a vegetarian, you just stay away from all of the meat. But so in Solomon's time, let's get back to Samuel. In Samuel's time, people were definitely meat eaters, especially in his culture. And so they didn't just go to the store to buy the meat. They raised the meat themselves in their own houses. And the animals, the little animals, like sometimes a little sheep or a little goat, would live right in the house with them so the fox wouldn't come and steal it. So here was Samuel and his mother coming every month, every year his mother would come to the temple, and she would bring an animal to sacrifice, and that would go along with her prayers. So here's how it goes. We let other people raise our animals. We buy them from the store. We cook them ourselves, and we say the blessing. The blessing is the way that we thank God for the animal itself. We thank God for the people who raised the animal, who prepared it, and especially for probably mom or dad who cooked the animal. But in Samuel's time, all of that was done near the temple. They'd bring the little animal that they had raised. It would be butchered there. The meat would be divided in a certain way. There were certain rules for how to divide the meat. And then they would portion out the meat to the family, and some would go to the priest. Well, here's where it gets interesting, because Eli had 2 sons who were cheating on this. They wanted the best part of the meat for themselves, not for the family who had raised the goat or the little sheep. And so they would do it the way they wanted to. And if anybody complained and they said, well, why don't you cut up the meat and divide it the way that God has told us to, the rules that we have? No. They weren't going to listen to that at all. So it was a great scandal. When people don't do what they're supposed to do, it causes trouble for everyone. So there was a great scandal about the way Eli's sons were behaving, and Eli didn't seem to notice. One night, Samuel, who lived at the temple all the time, he fell asleep and he heard a voice. Samuel, Samuel. His name was told twice. And so he thought, well, Eli must be calling me. So he ran down the hall to Eli's, I assume there was a hall. He ran down the hall to Eli's place and he said, here I am, you called me. Eli, trying to sleep, said, I didn't call you. Go back to sleep. So pretty soon the voice came again. Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel jumped up again. He ran down the hall that we think was there. And then he said, Eli, you called me. Here I am. Well, by the time this happened a third time, Eli figured out what was going on. He said, he remembered that Samuel was a gift from God. And he remembered that God would be calling him at some point in his life, even as a child. So he said, it's not me. God is calling you. And you need to go back to bed. And as soon as you hear that voice, you say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And Samuel copied the words to just make sure that he knew it. He said, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Now, that was the first time Samuel had ever said that, but we know that that was not the last time in his life, because he spent his whole life listening to God and sharing with people what God had spoken. So God said, I have a message for you. Samuel thinking, okay, what could this be? And he said, I have some news for you to tell Eli, and you need to tell him first thing in the morning. And then God whispered a message directly into Samuel's mind. Now, sometimes God will talk to us directly in our own minds, and suddenly everything will be very clear what we need to do. So that's exactly what happened to Samuel. Everything was very clear to him what he needed to do the next day. But he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do what God was asking him to do. We find that Moses didn't want to do what God was asking him to do. Who else? Saul didn't want to know what God was asking him to do. And then Paul in the New Testament didn't want to do what God was asking him to do. Lots of times God will ask you for something you think, I don't really want to do that. In fact, remember Jonah? What happened to Jonah when he tried to run away from what God wanted him to do? Did not turn out well for him. So, anyway, God really wanted him to do this, and so he thought, maybe if I just make myself scarce, Eli will forget the whole thing, and then I can just kind of disappear into the woodwork. So, that's not what happened. Eli came up to Samuel and he said, Samuel, what did God tell you? He didn't really want to tell a lie. That would not be a good start. So he said, well, he told me. And he started really slow. And Eli said, no, tell me exactly what God said. I'm ready to listen. Because Eli had this funny feeling that there might be a message for him or for all of the people. Samuel said, here's what God said. Your sons are cheating the people when they come to make sacrifices. Your sons are making fun of the worship of God. They're not taking the worship of God seriously. They're not respecting God's name or God's holy place of worship. They are going to die. Both your sons are going to die. The priesthood will be removed from your house, and you will die. Whoa! That was quite a message to deliver, wasn't it? Wasn't it amazing that God trusted such a young child with a message like that? And Eli said, let it be as the Lord has said. He accepted God's punishment. Now, Eli was a good priest, but he just couldn't handle those 2 boys he had, and things did not go well for him as a father. That's exactly what happened. The 2 sons were killed, and the 2 sons died in a war. There were lots of wars in those days. There's lots of wars these days, but this was a war that was close to home. And then Eli also died. Well, guess who God called next to be the prophet to rule over the people? None other than Samuel. This happened when Samuel was old enough to take that responsibility. So Samuel went along, and he was a good prophet. He listened to what God said. He shared the word of God with people. He never cheated anybody. He never said a lie to anybody. He was a good servant of God. And we all want to be good servants of God with the responsibility that we have been given. So one day, some people came up to him and said, Samuel, there's nothing wrong with you, but we don't want you ruling over us anymore. We want to have a king because all the other countries have kings, and we want to have a king. Samuel said, oh, I must not have been a good enough prophet that they want a king instead of me. He was very sad. He went to God. He and God had a conversation about this, and God said, this is not about you. And sometimes God tells us, this is not about you. So it really wasn't about Samuel. Samuel had done a good job. But the people wanted a king, and God said, let him have a king. That's fine. It's not you they're disrespecting, it's me. I'm being disrespected by these people. So I want you to know that you can tell the people, yes, you can have a king. And this is what you can expect when you have a king. He will take your sons and turn them into soldiers. He will take your daughters and turn them into bakers and servants. He will take your best animals, especially if there's horses, and he will take them into his service to pull his chariots. He will take your part of your money so he can pay his army. And on and on and on, went on with all these things that would happen if they had a king. You know what the people said? No, we really want a king because a king can go out and fight the wars for us, and we'd be like everybody else that way. Have you ever wanted to be like everybody else? Well, my son one time had an interesting idea. He thought if he wore a certain kind of shoes that was popular at that time, that everybody would be really respectful to him and really like him. And I said, well, why don't we buy you a pair of those shoes? And then why don't you come home and tell me how the people treat you? Turned out that even with the right pair of shoes, they treated him just the same way they had treated him before. He had to learn for himself how to make people respect him. The shoes didn't help. So anyway, these people, I digress. These people wanted a king. God had told them what they could expect from a king. They said, well, we want a king anyway. So Samuel was told by God, go and find them a king. I will show you who you need to anoint. Now, anointing is like confirmation, where the priest would take some oil, probably olive oil, and he would rub it on the head or even pour it on the head of the person who was going to be the first king. And how was he going to find the person who was going to be the first king? Was he supposed to look around? No, God said, you don't need to look. I will show you who the king is. My timer just went off. That was 15 minutes. So I'm leaving you with not knowing who the next king is. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you his name. When we get together again, we will learn more about the first king of the Israelites named Saul. Thank you for joining me.